Well, good morning. It is good to be with you. And this is my first time in San Antonio. I'm really excited to be here. I got to experience the Riverwalk yesterday and had Tex-Mex and got to enjoy that. And was grateful for this opportunity to take on this serious challenge that we have. And I've made it even more serious for myself by having 120 slides that we're going to work through today. And the core message that is going to go along with your lunch and hopefully your dessert is that the prevailing pattern of development that we see all around us is making North American cities and towns weak and fragile. And at Strong Towns, we seek to change that. We're a member-supported nonprofit. We have 6,500 members. Some of them are in the room today. And these members believe and understand that the things that we see around us are indicators that if our roads are failing, our services are being cut, our taxes are going up, we've got to change course. And this is the heart and soul of the Strong Towns movement. And so one of the conclusions that we'll work at today, sort of unpack, and for some of you, this will not sit easy. For others, this will confirm some of the things that perhaps you've already noticed and experienced in your places, is that the suburban experiment effectively banished the middle housing that we need and needed back in the day and still today. This is where you'll catch a few times where I'm going to take a little bit of liberties with the language that we use. Missing middle, we just banished it. We knew exactly where it was, and we said we don't want that. That doesn't belong in our city. So I get when we say these are missing housing types in our community, but we effectively banished them, and we're reaping the whirlwind as a result. And we can't afford to live this way. We seek to change that is the core of our conviction here. This is a preview of part of what we're going to talk about today. This is the net financial position in thousands of dollars for the city of San Antonio. And up there is zero. And down there is 4 billion. That is how far your liabilities exceed the available financial resources that you have in your city government to be able to cover its costs, without having to do drastic things like selling off roads, selling off community centers, selling off all of the physical assets, the laptops and the fire hoses that make up the work of what your city does, but just at its basic amount. How much do you bring in terms of your resources versus how much do you need to pay? This is your situation. We'll talk about how you got there. As I said, there's the zero. If you want to dive into this even further, there's more. The Strong Towns organization, our founder and president, released a book called Strong Towns: A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. If you're especially focused on housing, as I know you are, definitely check out Escaping the Housing Trap. I borrow some of the language and the responses that are described in that book, but I've tried to bring it here today for what we're facing in San Antonio. I'll also say, I'll try to leave this up briefly, but I'll come back to this later, is I did create a slide, a QR code. If you want to access resources related to this talk, that is available. In particular, the finance decoder elements that I just showed you there in preview. There's more of that material. If you're like, wait, what's the background on this? There will be more that's available there. But what is the work of building a city? What is the work of building anything that you intend to not just exist for a short duration, but for a long time? We know what a finite game is. That is a basketball game. It's got 4 quarters. Maybe it goes into overtime. But in that context, the coaches know that they need to use resources very carefully. At the start, they get their players ready, and they say, all right, work as hard on your first shift as your last shift. Any of you have been coaches or any of you have been players, you know that you're told, work as hard at the beginning as you do at the end, because there is an end. And so we want to finish strong, and then we can rest. Then we can relax. Then the game is over. But the work of building a community is an infinite game. Think of a charity curling match. Probably not a good analogy here in San Antonio. Imagine up in the north where people curl, or whatever you maybe have had baseball games that stretch on for days at a time. In that context, you play very differently. You don't play hard on the first shift. You begin to very carefully use your energy, because if Jimmy drops out and Sally drops out, suddenly you're down and you will not win the game, and you won't even be able to stay in the game. And what is happening is more and more of our communities are finding they can barely stay in the game. And yet they do. They linger on. Cities and municipalities linger on, providing less service, having to tax more, and feeling a deeper sense of despair at where things are going. And so in an infinite game, which is what building strong communities that are going to last for generations is, you have to have a different strategy. That strategy looks like making careful small bets. It looks like using scarce resources wisely. It looks like setting aside funds for later because you know that you don't know what the future holds, so you're going to hold and reserve the things that you need. You are $4 billion in the opposite of having a reserve. You're in a situation where you have far greater liabilities than even anything resembling a reserve in your community, and this is now the challenge that you face. This is the town that I live in Ladner, British Columbia. If I hadn't told you where it was, it could be any of many of the places that we have around us. This is an indication of that traditional development pattern, although I would die to have a boardwalk back just like that. But notice, they did simple things. They didn't pave the streets, very minimal public infrastructure because there was minimal or limited private infrastructure and private wealth in that area to sustain what they were doing together to build the community. But over time, this area began to thicken, that cattle pasture became something more, and the community began to develop. Because the recognition was, we're going to leave that street unpaved until we get to the point where we have a sustained surplus. We have enough capacity to then be able to have more available on average than needed. If you are in an infinite game, intending to pass on this city to not just children, but also grandchildren of people in your community, you have to be doing things that allow you to have sustained surplus, sustained capacity, sustained energy. If you're that curling coach, you're making sure we've got players that are still going to be at this on the third day. And in this context, this is what we need to really carefully consider. Here's the city of San Antonio, 1873. Guess where the downtown is? It's in the core of the community. You can see in that time, there was a gradual sort of developing of a core and then a building out from it. This is the traditional development pattern writ large across the North American landscape, but crucially, it's also the pattern that we see all over the world. The core collects resources, and then the periphery becomes places where there's opportunity, but over time, that opportunity gives rise to new building of a prosperity, and now the periphery gradually grows out. But tied into that is a thickening up, a maturing of these communities. This is the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, but you can notice that process unfolding as I talk about thickening up. That didn't look like a master plan. That looked like a whole bunch of people mastering the craft of using scarce resources really carefully. Notice the complexity. This is not anybody's dream of what their Sim City would look like, but it works. It provided housing of various types. It provided businesses and opportunities. Immigrants could come in and start something in maybe one of those little sheds and make it work because they didn't have to go through the begging, the genuflecting before a planning commission, even to get the slightest permission to do this. You see the use of lots. The recognition, the street is where the action is at. So we're going to situate our buildings up to the street, and eventually we're going to use more and more of our space. You can see this in your downtown. This is standard practice for building in a way that conserves scarce resources. And then incremental growth and adaptation. I have that slide pointing specifically to that little building there. I always say that's the place where you put the uncle that decided to move in with you, and you don't want him around your kids because he snores, not because of anything nefarious. And so you build an additional structure for him. You make it possible for that to occur. And in this context, and again, this is not a pipe dream. Imagine places in our communities where in rapid or fluid response to local housing need, we allow that housing to be built. That's the opposite of what we currently allow, the opposite of our processes, and this is the challenge that we face. If I didn't tell you this was Brainerd, Minnesota, it could be anywhere except for places that don't have trees like this. This is 1870, so right around the time of the picture I showed you of San Antonio. Brainerd, which is up in Minnesota, where Strongtown's headquarters is, had just been established. These are simple, modest structures. Think of even some of the little shotgun houses in some of your neighborhoods nearby the downtown, the first iteration of a life cycle of a neighborhood. But in 1894, in that same block, you saw the replacement of those initial structures, those initial small bets on maybe this place will grow, to the realization, yes, we should make investments here. So they began to use local stone, they began to use local brick, they began to thicken up. And notice already, this would violate most of the zoning standards in most of our new neighborhoods. This is only a 24-year-old neighborhood. Who's allowing 3 stories? Why are we doing such a thing? But this was the normal response to local need and the opportunities that it would then create. Just a number of years later, 1930, you can see more of the community being thickened up. You can begin to see some infrastructure being invested in. The streets are being maintained to a slightly higher standard because there's more private capacity to cover those costs. So yes, they were taking on responsibilities, but they had the surplus of available revenues from the community to be able to manage these costs. This is that same street today. Something happened. The suburban experiment happened. That pattern of development changed. Now, the thing that stands out is how superior the infrastructure is. Great street, lovely street lights, probably a whole lot of value under the ground, and so little happening on the private side. So little in requiring so much of either the property owners themselves or somebody else to foot the bill or to push off the bill for all of that maintenance, all of that upkeep. This is the change that we see all over our communities. And so when we ask, well, Norm, what's the traditional development pattern? The traditional development pattern prioritizes and allows for the assembly of increasingly independent neighborhoods. And some of our new developers, our new builders are doing this with much greater clarity, building communities, places where people can thrive. Look at we did a tour of the Pearl District. There's an understanding it cannot just be, as we saw in Santa Clarita, 3,000 homes with not a stick of retail, not a stick of commercial, not allowance for a home office. Well, you can do a home office, but you can't have clients in to visit. You can't do any of the economic opportunities that would allow for the thickening up of that place. In contrast, many of our downtowns in particular are realizing we have to allow for increasingly independent neighborhoods that are well-served, well-supplied, and that this happens over time, but it has to happen through a permission structure that makes this happen. It also prioritizes that we concentrate activity. We generate activity. We look for that activity instead of dispersing it. How often do we use parking standards to disperse buildings, even though it's the very thing that deadens the economic opportunities created by the buildings that are intended for that space? By being together, you build prosperity. So that incremental growth is driven by local needs that creates more opportunities through proximity. What did we do? We traded that complexity, remember the Grand Rapids slide, the complexity of that developing downtown area, sort of in its second life cycle as things were starting to thicken up. We traded all of that because we said that's messy. We're modern. We can do it differently. We can have growth and predictability. We can have a machine tool up, and this will be the thing that does it. And to juice that, we had policy that made this happen, the widespread adoption of zoning bylaws, the widespread adoption of parking standards, the widespread pitch of urban renewal schemes in the 1960s, the Mercy, I showed you a picture of my downtown in my village, and that village was all destined for the bulldozer because of our urban development plans. The great mercy was we didn't have the money at that time to actually knock it down. And because we didn't, we actually still have it, and that's what we actually still value, even as we make it really difficult to adapt or reuse some of those structures. But we did this also in a flurry of construction post-World War II that resulted in a dramatically simplified method of building out cities. We banished messiness, we banished middle housing, we banished these types of things, but made it extremely fragile. This was a pattern that had to work flawlessly or the cracks would begin to emerge. And so the suburban experiment was and is a radical departure from the traditional development pattern. It is having our neighborhoods persist in a state of perpetual adolescence. I love these guys. I bet they're great, but I hope they've grown up. I hope they found a job. I hope they worked at finding their own place to live. I hope that they've taken steps. I have a 10-year-old son. On the one hand, I wish he was still a baby because he was adorable, but I'm glad he's 10, and I can't wait for him to be 20. And yet with our neighborhoods, we said, let's build them all at once to a finished state and then have them remain in that state in perpetuity. This is a street in Delta, the community outside of Vancouver, British Columbia that I'm at. There's a couple more homes. They filled in that empty lot, but otherwise it still looks the same from the 1960s. That's stunning. That is a different pattern of development than what we see in the Michigan example, what we saw in Brainerd, what we saw in San Antonio. Now, what are the implications? Can we afford to do this? What brought you here was the lunch, as well as the people you get to see. But in the title of the presentation was, what is the cost of sprawl? Well, you're not Kansas City, but Kansas City's challenge rhymes with yours. In 1910 to 2010, they had a 1.8 increase in population, but they increased their infrastructure obligation per person by 27 times. It's even worse in places that have experienced population decline. With the best of intentions, they said, we found a new method. We can grow in South Bend. Then the population began to move away. And in that context, they were stuck on a per person basis with I can barely even pronounce 1,333% and 6,452%. I can't even wrap my mind around how much of an increase that is. And again, this is saying we will no longer need to live in a more compact development pattern. In fact, we're going to make it impossible with minimum lot sizes, setback requirements, parking requirements, all of the things that make for a great city, only we won't be able to actually afford it. Your city, I'm stealing this from Joe Minicosi's presentation that he gave a couple months ago here in San Antonio. I linked to it in my resource page. Definitely recommend that you check it out. He had 144 slides, so he outmarched me. But they did the math. 707 miles of stormwater pipe is currently in the ground, aging in place, which unlike with seniors is not great. It just means we're going to have to deal with that eventually. And that could get you all the way to Memphis if you stretched it out. Roads, I love this one. You've got to go via New York City all the way out to Las Vegas before you would have exhausted the supply of roads that you have in your community. And so tell me if this looks familiar. This is Fresno's annexation pattern. Fresno, core community. Think of that initial image I showed you of Ladner, or even of San Antonio in slightly earlier context. Very simple structures. You're beginning to see the community thicken up, and they are beginning to expand outward, but much of that activity is inward and upward, because that's what you do. You use your resources, you begin to unlock the next increment of development. 1922, they're in the roaring 20s, you're seeing some development. There's almost certainly a streetcar or a transit system that's enabling that type of development. By 1934, they've gone through the Great Depression. They still added some neighborhoods, but they're still very careful. They're using scarce resources. The property tax base, think the South Bend example, the amount of lift stations required to get water into homes and sewage away from homes is pretty modest when it's set up this way. 1946, through the course of the Second World War, they're still building out, beginning to add new neighborhoods, but then the pattern begins to shift. 1958, 1970, I don't even know what that big green speck at the corner is, but that's now part of the city, and this is part of their broadening obligation. Their roads and pipes stretching to Memphis and Las Vegas that they are taking on. They are inheriting now a pattern of responsibility to keep up all of this with a limited tax base compared with what, as a percentage, they used to have. 1983, 1995, and then 2010. Now, is it working? That's the question, right? With an experiment, you should ask the question, is this working? And this is in Flagstaff, Arizona, but I took a granular photo of their retail. It's just above the highway. Their retail sort of commercial core, historic district. It's the only area that they need an inset on their map to show. And then below it is the residences. And I said, why would you build this way? You live too close to your neighbors, right? That's not very American. You probably can even sometimes see them on the sidewalk, and they can see into your front window. We probably don't want that at any point in our history. We've never had to live this way until today when people are put in sky towers. No. You built this way to carefully use resources and to unlock the potential for prosperity among all participants. In contrast, their newer development looks a lot like San Antonio's newer development. And I said, what does it cost you to build this way? And this is where that blue slide that I introduced earlier comes back. The finance decoder is what Strong Towns has put together from standards of accounting that the Canadian equivalent of the Government Finance Officers Association has put together. And they publish 7 metrics by which we can assess the longer-term pattern of how our cities are doing financially. And the challenge that we have is that most of our communities look, did we balance our budget this year like we have to? What extreme measures did we have to go through in order to do that? That's the other challenge. But in that context, so long as we balance our budget and our bond rating doesn't budge, we're fine, right? And so coming from your documents, I did this in I did them all the way from 2009 to present day. It took me about 50 minutes. So you can do this as well if you want to check the math. Scan that resource page, that is available there. But we're going to go through 3 indicators that accountants up in Canada published and made available, and they work with your numbers, they work with our numbers north of the border on 3 metrics. How sustainable is your community's pattern? How flexible is your city when bad things happen? And we know they will. And then how vulnerable are you to higher levels of government? And so let's talk about sustainability indicators to start. This is that first one. Your net financial position in thousands of dollars. This is the difference between the city's financial assets, like its cash and receivables, the money you have on hand, and its liabilities. So everything you bring home on payday, as well as anything that you've stocked away in your mattress, versus how much is on your credit card bill. This is the cumulative surplus or deficit that the city has accumulated through successive budget cycles. So there you are down at $4 billion, but when I ran the numbers last night in my hotel room all the way back to 2009, look at where you were in 2009. Something has begun to really change. And it isn't that new development is the cost of this, it's that the bills are coming due. The bills of long-awaited and long put off infrastructure renewal are the things that are driving this down, as well as the increased borrowing in your capital budgets in order to be able to cover your basic requirements. But over the longer term, you're sapping your capacity to be a sustainable community. I'll tell you, many cities are above zero. Many cities are in a healthier position, but you're not. You're better than Houston, so if that helps. You're not in as bad a situation as Houston is, but it was telling that the city of Houston, when they released their net financial position this year, they put out a press release because they said, our net financial position has improved this year. But it's like negative $6 billion to like slightly less than negative $6 billion. So what we take as progress on a one-year snapshot does not look that way when we look at it over the longer span. And these are your numbers. This is not, I didn't do any fancy math. I'll show you in 50 minutes how to do this yourself. What about your financial assets to your total liabilities? So again, all of your financial assets, your cash, your receivables, divided by your total liabilities. It's just another way of showing your net financial position. My city, we're at a 2.2 ratio of financial assets to total liabilities. If you're below 1, that means for every $1 you have, you owe more than that, which is what is showing here. And again, we can see that decline over time. We can see that shift that is occurring. Total assets to total liabilities. The value of all the city's assets, including your infrastructure, divided by its total liabilities. Sorry, this is the one you don't want to be below 1. This is the one that we would say, well, things are starting to trend up only if we begin to ignore what we previously had. We were over $2 of every asset that we had for the liabilities that we had, which is a challenge. It means you're having to run very thin. It means operating budgets are always going to be stretched. Remember, one of the things that we sometimes do with our assets, what we consider to, our community centers, those types of things, what we will do is say, well, we will put any maintenance in our upcoming capital budget. That upcoming capital budget is largely, the accountants will quibble with this, but it's largely taking from future operating budgets so that way you don't have to deal with it today. Or if you were storing up a surplus, the surplus from prior operating budgets would be that portion that could then cover your capital costs this year. And so the challenge that we have is that we're degrading our ability to cover our debts. Now, how much debt do you have as a comparison to your total revenue that you bring in as a city? So how much money comes in versus how much do you owe? This is a helpful ratio to ask how sustainable is our city. Again, this was, at first I was like, okay, I mean, it's going down, which is good. The trouble is, it went up. The trouble is, it went up significantly. And this is the challenge. When you have doubled the amount of debt that you have in comparison to your total revenues, it means you are much less sustainable. A lot more is having to be spent on interest, as we'll see in a moment. And so let's talk about flexibility indicators. How flexible are you? If something bad happens, do you have the ability to now go and borrow? For example, your amount of interest spent as a comparison to your total revenues. Let's look at this over time. That has shrunk. So that's good, but sometimes that will be as a consequence of either deferring payment or it will be a result of interest rates moving up and down. I'm not sure what happened in 2013, but if we go back, we can actually see there was a significant jump in debt in 2013. So I suspect there was a major project that was brought online finally, or something along those lines, and the bond or the debt was issued at that point, and there was some flurry of additional interest. Well, however that worked, but what you're seeing is your ratio is slowly becoming more flexible. This is one of the beneficial things if interest rates are working in your favor, to at minimum be able to bring down the obligation that you have in your city. But let's look also, again, I'm throwing a lot of this, I've got two more to go. Your net book value, how much everything in your city, in terms of its physical assets, how much is it worth compared to its original cost? So your accountants will tell you you need to depreciate your assets. So if I buy a $100 laptop this year, in 5 years, it basically has exhausted its value. And so I shouldn't be banking on having $100 because I have a $100 laptop. The accountant wisely says that thing is worth nothing after 5 years. Roads, 25 years, community centers, 40 years before most of their value has been sapped and you need to do major renewal. You can imagine this. And so out of this, the trouble is that most of your assets are below 60% in terms of their actual value, and this is trending downwards, which is especially alarming when you have brought on, as your city has started to rebound, you've done more public outlay, you've built new things. If you have built new things and they're still fresh and shiny and still have the fresh car smell in them, what you should expect is that number is going up. We see a lot of fast growth suburbs where their numbers here actually look pretty good because their parks are still fresh. They haven't depreciated yet. They're still quite brand new. But the trouble is when you're adding things and that number is still going down, it's revealing a growing chasm in what you can actually manage and how much you are falling behind on your core obligations as a city. And I'll say this again. I know it's setting the conclusion in front of more of the evidence, but this is the cost of sprawl. This is not the cost of downtown renewal. This is the cost of sprawl. And we're going to look at the consequences of this in just a moment. But last thing, how much do you trust your governments? Not your local government, they're great. But how much do you trust the state government and the federal government to persistently rob Peter to pay Paul? That's what it is when they transfer money to San Antonio and not to Austin. Or maybe to all of Austin and all of these things, but it's going to come at the expense of other programs, other things like this. The share of the city's income that comes from state or federal aid is over 15% right now, down from 20%. We can see the COVID years where there was that spike where federal money was coming in, state money was coming in. But you can see you've had a very rocky roller coaster, points where almost 25% of your city's budget was coming from higher levels of government. That works. When you say, we're bringing in the pork, we're bringing in the dough, we're getting our fair share, right? It came out of everybody's wallet, so at least we're getting some of it. I'll tell you, state and federal governments are capricious. State and federal governments also have shifting priorities. The city of Detroit, if we go back before 2008, the city of Detroit was actually humming along. They knew they were in trouble, but state and federal transfers were growing as a percentage of their total revenue. But they kept coming in. And then just before 2008, we can show it in the math, they stopped coming in. The transfer stopped, the city went bankrupt. That is what it is to be so vulnerable to higher levels of government that have shifting and different allegiances than to your city. And so as co-owners of this cooperative effort of building a great, strong city, do you want responsibility? And do you want to take hold of the things that you have within your power to be a less vulnerable city, to be more resilient, to be more capable? And this is where that shift through the change in development pattern meant that we burned through our cash reserves. We then took out bonds to try to cover the cost of new builds rather than paying for it with cash. And now we're increasingly facing the challenge of insolvency. As one Strong Towns member said, we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. Now I'm at the halfway mark, and so we got to assess our experiment. What did we change, and how is it going? I was never great in science class, so I'm sure there's a whole bunch more. Is this a controllable study? All of that stuff. No. Are there federal grants for the research that I want to do? No. We're just asking, with this continent-wide experiment that we've done, in building communities very differently than our ancestors did, we changed a lot of the variables. So how's it going? Well, financially, it's not going great. Financially, we are in a hole. And your city is not alone. I'm not picking on San Antonio. If I was, I'd pick on Houston more. But the reality is you have this challenge that you together need to come up with a response. And so a key part of this is that we're in a financial disaster. We call this a Ponzi scheme, where much of the deferred maintenance or the obligations we had, new neighborhoods get built out, the developers would entrust all of those assets to the city, and the city said, hey, honey, guess what I got today? Roads and pipes and parks. And then, being a wise wife, she said, but 30 years from now, are you going to have money? Like right now, we're going to have to start putting aside money to be able to repair that, And we said, no. What we'll do is we'll grow, so that way then we'll have new money coming in from new developers. We'll charge them higher and higher development fees, and then we can cover the cost for these projects. Tell me if that doesn't sound familiar. We have this mantra, this idea that growth must pay for growth. And that's often used as a cudgel to stop new development. The assumption is that past growth paid for itself. But it's not. Yes, they did a basic layout of infrastructure, but the actual ongoing costs of that infrastructure are much longer than just the first time that you build it. The first time you put the pipe in the ground, it's easy. The next time you dig it up, you annoy everybody and the cost went way higher. That is the challenge that we face in our communities. And so let's talk about the cost of sprawl is tied to the depreciation of our ability to generate revenues with existing land. The city of San Diego, now that annexation seems to be in the rearview mirror to a certain extent, is not going to acquire more land, but you can do more with it. Especially your existing neighborhoods. Housing, for example, belongs in housing lands. We should be expecting this to happen. And so one of the things that we like to do is ask, do you compare cars by miles per tank? If you do, you probably won't get very far in that weird looking thing over there, but the Ford will get you pretty far. If you put a slip tank in the back, that thing could be king of the hill in terms of how far you go. But what have we realized? If it's just a measure, not of comfort or safety or how convenient it might be, if it's just a measure of how much are we going to have to spend to get the same type of outcome, we measure by mile per gallon. And when we do that, we compare them similarly. Yes, there are features of that Ford, but we also take it on the chin that it'll cost us more to go a mile. And we say, okay, I'm willing to do that for lifestyle reasons, for all of these things. If you're going to buy the Bugatti, you're probably not worried about gas mileage. But cities need to be. Again, this is borrowing from Urban 3, who've done great work. But they do a map of the value of all of the parcels of property within your county and then within your downtown. And they've laid them out in the heat map format to show you where the market value per acre is highest, and then on a parcel basis, where it's lowest. So all of the dark green is below $1 million per acre. So those are your Ford trucks. And all of that downtown stuff, the Canopy by Hilton at $201 million per acre. If you were to build out at that level of intensity, you would see that amount of revenue established as a wealth pot, essentially, from which you could then take a portion to be able to fund public services. Remember, taxation, no matter what stripe you have, unless you're an anarchist that refuses to tax anybody, we don't have too many of them because they go broke. In that context, no matter your political stripes, you're always going to accept that from our private capacity or from our private wealth, we're willing to have a portion go towards the needs of the commonwealth, the things that we do together. That's why we do accept taxation. In that context, we might differ on how much of that portion of our wealth needs to be there, but at minimum, we have to have wealth in order to be able to pay a portion of it yearly in property taxes and other taxes to our community. We need to have money attached to our wallet that we can then withdraw from in order to fund the things that we like, the parks that we want, the roads we drive on, the sewage that gets taken away conveniently, and the water that comes in that's clean and safe for us. And so in this context, Urban 3 took a look at it and they said, how productive is your downtown compared to the rest of the county, including the city? It's 12 times as productive. And you say, well, yeah, that's because there's towers. That's because there's large institutional landlords. Actually, it's because the pattern of development is far more productive because it's granular. It allows for a lot more uses to occur. The land is being used a lot more effectively. Let's look at Walmarts. We've imported them to Canada as well. I shop at Walmart, so I absolutely understand the necessity of these things. However, the way in which they're built is something that is a variable that even Walmart is changing now. Removing as much of the parking that they used to provide. They're beginning to create more compact centers because they recognize we've done something to ourselves, but especially to our cities. The average value of these Walmarts is $0.6 million in San Antonio. Let's compare that to single-family residential, what I call the Ford truck sort of zone. These single-family homes, standard, typical, very normal suburban standard development, comes in at $1 million per acre. So it's outperforming the big box stores or the power centers, ironically called power centers, even though they're weakening our communities. But in this context, these average is $1 million per acre. What about your estates? I mean, where the wealthy are, that's where the tax dollars come in, right? I went to one city and they said, yeah, like those areas, that's our money pot. And in the downtown, that's our money pit. You don't want to go there. It's just a drain on our city. I said, hold on a minute. This comes in at $0.2 million per acre. If you don't use the land very effectively or very productively, the county assessor says, well, what am I going to do? I can't justify a large tax bill, even if their per property tax bill is higher. On a per acre basis, it's actually a really poor performer. And so in this context, I said, the suburban experiment banished the missing middle, and we can't afford to live this way. Let's look at that. When I say the missing middle, these are those types of homes that naturally occurred in our communities as they thickened up until we made them very difficult, if not impossible, to build. But you've been building them recently, and you have them historically. Some of your best performers are your historic buildings that we see in many of these neighborhoods where it's actively been downzoned so that if that building burned down, you couldn't rebuild that courtyard cottage. You couldn't rebuild that small walk-up apartment. In this context, even that duplex almost comes in at the same rate as the single-family residence, but then you slightly make the duplex a little bit more complex or compact. You have double the population. You have double the participants willing to spend taxes. Now you have $1 million an acre. Townhomes at 1.9. Other types of townhomes, 2.5. You can see that the numbers just gain in value as you begin to make slightly better use of your land. And you need to because you're in the hole. You need to because your city relies on revenues to cover not just present-day needs, but also future obligations. $1.4 million is per acre, the average here. But if we go slightly denser, a slightly denser density here, $1.5 million for the terraces, 1.9 for parkside apartments. And again, that's not like postcard urbanism. That's not the stuff that wins awards, but it's a workhorse in your city. And we said, yeah, nah, I don't need it. It doesn't, if I had my preference, I'd rather have steak than a hamburger. And so I just give us steak. Let us live the way that we want to live, right? Yeah, absolutely. But then we're going to have to charge you what it costs to live that way. And that's where people balk. That's where people begin to see, as our services are increasingly being cut, our taxes are going up, and people are saying, I'm still not getting anything more for what we have. And it's because we have so few participants at the table participating in actively adding to the coffers of our community. 35 million, 14 million, all of these things, if we average them out, over $2.4 million per acre in multifamily residential. And so if we compare this, we can see that we are underperforming in the thing we have the most of. And if I talked about the traditional development pattern is for this purpose, to then say, we need to get out of our way to allow the next increment of development in these single-family neighborhoods to emerge by right. And the state has stepped in to make some of that possible. You're beginning to see the inclusion in the historic district of pre-approved casitas. You're starting to see some of those things mature and be available to you. But the reality is you need to allow more. We need to stop harming ourselves or throttling ourselves. Imagine a duck. If you've ever seen those pitiful images of a duck with a string around its neck or the soda can holders on it, the only thing that that duck can do is not grow. But if it ages at all, if it changes at all, if it gets its heart rate up, that is going to become a constrictor on it as it is there. And this is what we've done with our zoning standards as well. Similarly, let's talk about historic commercial. Notice the range of value, but the significant store of value in what you used to do, what you used to permit, what used to be commonplace, and thankfully is now starting to come back in our whole ethos of what we want to see in our communities. This is a historic building built in the 1920s, $49.5 million per acre. The River Walk, starting to see all of that dynamic activity occurring, $97 million for the Palacio de Rio. All of those things coming in a really healthy contribution to your city's coffers from many different participants. It's not asking a single person to pay a big tax bill, it's spreading it out over many and doing so together. Your Pearl District, $11.5 million. This is the type of stuff that is driving the opportunity, but your residential neighborhoods that are unchanged are lagging behind and costing you dearly. This is where the question, how much roadway is required in the Pearl District? How much roadway is required in the Riverwalk District? How much roadway is required in length of pipe? Distance in which you need to get the measurements just right, the pressures, the pumps, all of those situations that you cannot afford a single breakdown in any of those systems. In your more compact areas, it works a lot easier. Yes, your capacity is larger in those zones, but it actually is over the span of how far you need to go, not that costly to build that way. But when you're building roads out to Las Vegas, and not even directly, you know that you've committed yourself. You are right now, as Urban 3 has mapped out, the second of your rebuild stages. This is the challenge that you're in. And those early stages, the early stuff that is now being redeveloped, that was the type of stuff that is coming in at $10 million an acre or $2.5 million per acre. Those neighborhoods can actually justify that type of investment. The trouble will be when you move on from this, when you move on from these spaces to the places that are generating less. Are you even willing to do the road work required? We drove through some of your residential neighborhoods and I noticed, streets are falling apart because there's a recognition we simply cannot prioritize these. But the sidewalks in the Riverwalk District are in good shape because there's actually sufficient revenues coming in this context. Can you justify continued expenditure on these leafy areas when they're generating so little in return for your community? Your current spending on roads, $282 million, but you've got to nearly double that in order to account for the actual place that you're in your life cycle costs and what is needing to be repaired. Your 4,300 miles are not necessarily as impressive as they might at first seem. Similarly, stormwater, $93 million, but almost a doubling again of needed spending, and you can't keep up with it. This is a crippling balance when you also are $4 billion behind in terms of just keeping up with your liabilities as you've added them. This is your net financial position, and you're in a challenging place. And so I'm going to pivot specifically to what we can do to allow our neighborhoods to thicken up, to experience that next increment of development without causing chaos, without causing an uproar, without causing public lynchings or anything of the sort. And we talk about this in terms of simple things that cities, yes, cities, must and should be doing to be housing ready. We actually have a map where we are publishing all of the cities that are documenting how close they are to being on the Strong Town standard housing ready. Most of them are at like 4 or 5 of the key measures that they've taken of 6. And what we're also having is developers coming to us saying, I know that my city is failing, so I'm actually thinking, where should I invest dollars if I want a long-term return? Not somewhere that's going to go into a period of decline, but a place that is going to actually be able to keep up with the needs and create a great quality of life. If you go to strongtowns.org/housing ready, that's where you can see more of this. But the first one that we say is you need to allow single family home conversion to duplex or triplex by right. And then not just saying by right, but actually making that process simple and easy. Make that process smooth to say, hey, you're building in a neighborhood? Yep. You're building a home? Perfect. You're adding an in-law suite? Excellent. You're making that process, and we know that much of what we consider multifamily has to go through the same pattern, the gauntlet, that a lot of our larger projects go through, and that just doesn't work. That is making it really difficult for somebody who hangs drywall to say, I'm going to take on a weekend project. Somebody that lays pipe to come in and say, I'm going to do this in a 3-month sprint to build this out, and then I can sell off that second unit and make that possible. Good cities make that possible, and you can be pushing towards this. One of my party tricks whenever I do a housing walking tour is I'll look at a building, especially when it's less obvious, and they'll say, how many people live in this house? And then my answer is, it doesn't matter. It's just a good building, and it can be used in various ways. This is a shell in which many different types of uses can be happening. That left could actually be a lawyer's office, and it wouldn't harm us. Well, yeah, I won't pick on lawyers. In this context, we need to allow this. And this is the type of even stealth density or gentle density that begins to move the needle and allow for neighborhood investment to occur. Permitting backyard cottages in all residential zones. For our planners and developers, I do this myself. I talk about ADUs. At Strong Towns, one of our hallmarks is trying to give people the language to use that a city manager can share with a resident, with a member of their council, or a member of their professional staff. And we're trying to get a general shift in saying, instead of saying ADU, can we use language like backyard cottage or coach house? That's my favorite. Honey, today I bought a coach house. Oh, we're moving up in the world. In that context, when we call it an ADU or an accessory dwelling unit, we're actually devaluing the very thing that it is. And the other part that we can change in our language is these are not units, they're homes. They're homes, and people need them, and probably people you know need them. And maybe you need them as well. I'm a renter, so I need one. So if you're selling, let me know if you're willing to sell at a discount. My city makes this difficult. We have a single detached residential coach house zone because it couldn't fit in any of the others. And I went to my city planning director. I said, Marcy, copy and paste the rules for the coach house into all of those others. And then if it doesn't fit within the lot alignments, the builder will tell you. They'll say, hey, I know I could have built it, but this is an irregular lot, so I recognize that won't fit in. Instead, you have to go through the zoning process, and it's brutal. These are simple structures. You can have standards for what they look like because people get worked up about this. The cost is not that much higher for gabled roofs. Let that happen. To the modernist architects in the room, that may appall you, but please, for the sake of the rest of us, I know I'm picking on you, but this is just before dessert, before I sweeten up a little. We've got to allow people not to be shocked by what moves in next door, and some of that is aesthetic, and some of that is an opportunity for us to just say, we've brought this in, see, that wasn't so bad. This is the way in which we need to approach this idea, gentle density or stealth density. I always say, it's sort of like waking up one day, and there's a cottage in your backyard, and somebody is handing you the rent check because it's rented, and you're like, oh, actually, I wasn't even using that part of my yard, and now this is working for me, and we can get to that. We need to legalize starter homes in all residential zones, especially on irregular plots. How many sizes of lots are there in the city? Find the ones that are smaller and say you can build something smaller. Instead, many of our standards and requirements are way too high. This ties into the idea of entry-level housing. It's not necessarily going to be new construction. It'll look like lower-cost homes that are created through code-compliant changes to existing properties. And then working with your realtors, working with your registry offices, working with your city to allow them to be sold fee simple. So that way nobody has to stay in a persistent renting relationship, creating opportunities for banks to give mortgages for backyard units. It happens all the time in other jurisdictions, and I don't know the rules here, but definitely it's something to work at if you're in finance or on these things. These are little shotgun houses, but they're new. Somebody just said, I can build a bunch of these, and I can build, if I build 3 of them on a lot that I would otherwise build 2 homes, I can sell to 3 buyers. I can move 3 families into this zone within reaching distance of Pensacola's entertainment district. And it works, and guess what? They're already working to renovate the attic of this building. Mark is. Gottschalk is one of Strong Town's members, and he's looking to put a granny flat in the back. That's that next increment rapidly beginning to emerge. This is not bad development. This is the change that we need in our communities. You are not well served by minimum lot sizes at all. I have yet to find a compelling, cogent argument for why we need them, except if we want to exclude by class and status. We use minimum lot sizes as a wealth capture or a filter, and they don't belong. Small homes fit in small cracks, small spaces. Typically, if you're in a home like this, you're not going to have a lifestyle that generates additional cars, RVs, and all of these things. You're going to live modestly, and you're going to live carefully, and you're going to value the fact that you're in walking distance of amenities and services. We've done studies, and Strong Towns member Ashley Salvador did a study of in their community, they call them garden suites. She looked at garden suites in Edmonton, Alberta, and she said the vast majority of them were rented either at just below market rate or free to family members, to people who are in need. She also did a study and asked, how many of you in your garden suite have a car? Over 50% of them didn't even own a vehicle in Edmonton. I mean, you can walk in San Antonio and you won't freeze to death in a snowbank. Edmonton. And yet people were walking because they said, that's my lifestyle, that's my budget, that's what I can manage. And the consequence was they were beginning to see the introduction of these types of housing stock within their community. This is a great project, the South Street Cottages master plan in Fayetteville, Arkansas. It's irregular. They found a parcel. They plunked in a bunch of homes. The minimum units per acre would have actually been appalled by this, but the reality is this works. This is not hyper density. This doesn't even have to be a tower, it just works. Another core thing is we need to repeal our parking mandates. I'm at 50 minutes, so I won't go too deeply into parking, but I'll say there's always going to be a market requirement for parking. You as a developer or a builder, if that's your trade and craft, you're going to decide probably if I'm selling brand new luxury units, I've got to provide some parking. That's expected. But what if other people are willing to make a gamble on building without that available parking? We know that people are doing it. We know that there's great success in doing it. We know that that's definitely possible. And so a market requirement allows on a lot by lot basis for the figuring out of how much parking to be provided to be done by the person that owns that property and develops that property. Citywide parking requirements are trying to overlay some mathematical calculation onto thousands of distinct properties in dozens of different neighborhoods. And there's no way in which you actually are doing any meaningful good with these types of standards. My city, 2.2 parking spaces per unit. Where's the 2.2 coming in? That's defaulting to 3 for any multifamily. It's creating all of these challenging conditions. And so there's so much more on paid street parking and some of those other challenges that you get from this. But the reality is we've got to be able to do these types of things. Number 6, this is the one that actually most cities have said, but we're still working at this, streamlining the approval process. There's sometimes this concern, well, it's a state level issue, or we have to go through the process, or we have to keep our planners paid. Defaulting more to buy right up front. Somebody says, I want to do a project here. You say, yep, this is exactly what that looks like. This looks like pre-approved housing templates, or even better, pre-approved housing plans like in South Bend, Indiana, and Kalamazoo, Michigan. The fire chief has already signed off on all 6 of those. The engineering department is already committed that if this comes in, they already know where the water hydrant connection is going to be. You make it work at the lot level, but you know all of these things. You could walk in like a vending machine saying, I want that one, and I want that one. They have plans for 6 plexes, 4 plexes, 3 plexes, duplexes, and even single-family homes with attached garden units. And it just works. It narrows and shortens the permitting process. I'm saying yes to new housing before anyone even asks. And the city is doing this with your casita plan, but why is it just for the housing district? If you are a historic district, if you like the look of a casita, see if other people do. See if it fits in the rest of your city, if it's actually true to the history of San Antonio. And they look good. Why is it only in specific districts? Why do we stand in our way making this difficult? Because we need to lower the bar of entry. This is a lot that is not dissimilar, an overhead look of what is in many of the patchy sort of parts of our neighborhoods. And to ask the question, how do we get to the point where we begin to see many hands engaged in the work of adding in the types of homes that can fit into these spaces. And doing so in a way that doesn't require assembly, so that way all of a sudden all of the block is taken away and a whole new townhouse complex comes in. Sometimes if you're closer to your downtown or closer to a village core, you're going to need to do that. But in many other cases, existing residential neighborhoods should be prepared for and ready for and allow for the next increment of development in that neighborhood. And in this case, that is what that looks like. And then you can justify the amount of public investment in the streets and the pipes that are adjacent to it. One quick note too, I've got a couple of things on language. Infill, that's something you get at the dentist. It's neighborhood investment. And I think sometimes we mean well when we talk infill. Infill is from the perspective of a planner. Now, I'm grossly mischaracterizing it perhaps in some of your view. But it's from the perspective of a planner looking at what we previously had here and says, well, we need to fill that in. Who doesn't want it to be filled in? These people. But if you say you can invest in your neighborhood, they're like, well, I don't have the capacity, but I know that my son is interested. Yeah, we're going to make that possible. And we're going to not stand in your way. We're going to allow what we've actually severed was that vital artery of investment routinely occurring in our communities. What is a blighted neighborhood? Is a place where no one has confidence to invest their own money or even somebody else's money to make something happen. So we need to allow this to occur. That's why we say we need to legalize the next increment of development by right. And then if you need to skip steps in those increments, then you go through a more formal process. Then you go through the process, which even in the downtown, they've recognized the next increment in your downtown is towers. And so those are largely available by right, and you can make progress in that. And so if we allow not just as it is, but the next increment, you'll begin to see this occur. The city of Minneapolis did this citywide to allow duplexes and maybe triplexes with a backyard component to it. The uptake was slow and gradual. That's why there's not a revolution over it. That's why they haven't had to cancel it. It isn't that suddenly a pocket neighborhood suddenly is completely overrun by new development. Instead, they said you can do it wherever, and in places where it was needed most, it began to occur. We need to legalize small, love the phrase of no assembly required, considering existing property lines. Figure out, is there any way that creative builders can just build within the existing confines? I understand some of your big projects that you have worked on, especially if you're incorporating a lot of parking, are going to require the assembly of multiple lots. But actually, not every project needs to be like this. And you need to recreate that cottage industry of people that build cottages, getting them engaged again, participating in this. I told the crew that I was going to introduce single stairway design options. Just as one quick example of this, for a 4 to 6 story building on a small lot, the typical cost of the requirement to build a second stairway and connect the two with the central corridor and every level adds about 6 to 13%. The additional stairway and the corridor consume about 7% of the building's floor area. So that's non-sellable floor area that could otherwise be a child's bedroom, it could otherwise be a larger living room, whatever it is that people would want it to be. The second stairway adds significant cost without measurable benefit. Even from a fire safety perspective, a single corridor tends to funnel the air through it and pass the smoke into other zones. There's all sorts of reasons why fire departments in Seattle and other places have long since stood down on the idea that single stairways are death traps. They're not. Go visit them, learn about them. This is one of those things, if you want to do smaller scale development that's a little bit gentler in your communities, that doesn't require the whole block to be knocked down, single stair is not the only panacea, but it certainly helps. We can't let our streets be less than a platform for building wealth, and this exists in our residential neighborhoods especially. Do they build wealth over time? House values going up is a good thing, but if that house value increases in part because now there's 2 homes there and it's worth slightly more, that actually has a knock-on effect for the whole benefit of the city. We need to remove our aversions to adaptation as well. I'll say this to provoke and then go quickly have my dessert. We need to guard against things that are built into our suburban standards. And I would say there are 3 hallmarks to our suburban standards, and you can see it in the planning documents, explicitly or implicitly. 1, strategic exclusion by class or status. Go check. There's so many different things. Minimum lot size is the most visible. There's so many other tools that were used to strategically exclude those people. 2nd, resistance to change. Even the promise of no change. How many realtors have promised in their promotional brochures views of, well, not mountains, whatever naturally, my area is views of the mountains and the ocean. And in fact, we have towers that are sold 360-degree views. That's on the sales brochure, even though they know that they are going to be the marketers for the next tower that's built next door. We should just accept we are going to change. And in that context, not lock ourselves into a pattern that says, yes, resistance is best. Let's keep all of this away. And then 3rd, and crucially, the assumption of auto-dependency. Allowing for automobile use, absolutely. Understanding auto-dependency is a consequence of our development pattern, for sure. But the assumption always up front that everybody is dependent on an auto, so we have to design, and we cannot approve projects that don't basically start and end with, will this work for people and vehicles, is a huge problem. I'll tell you this, the Riverwalk doesn't work for people in cars. I don't think there's been anybody driving a car down there, but there's a lot of people managing to access that space, managing to find parking elsewhere, and then being drawn to the locus that is a vibrant, dynamic neighborhood, a good village core, and we can have more of these begin to emerge in our communities if we let them. Finally, we need to make many small bets. I'm a pastor, so I'm allowed to say, I was a pastor for 10 years, so I'm allowed to say finally, and then just keep going. But the strategy needed for this game is decidedly different. We're in an infinite game. We need to be sure that we're making these bets and that they're holding true, that we're learning from them, and we're willing to change. And as we do this, your city is fast growing. It's changing quickly. It is a struggle to keep up your infrastructure. Housing is hard to build and hard to afford, and small and practical projects still face hurdles. Those are your challenges, and the stakes are high. But the truth is that you certainly can take this on. Asking yourself, what is the role that you play? Asking and then sharing, what are the barriers that you face? And if you ask a question in the Q&A, I would love to have you start by saying, what role do you play in your community, and what are some of the barriers that you face? And then offer your rebuttals or your rejections or your complaints. But at that point, what I want to say is I'm so grateful for this chance to be able to give some thought, some provocation, some opportunity for reflection for you. And it's been a privilege to spend this time with you. Thank you very much.